hidden deep in the Montana Territory records. Sealed away for more than 100 years, rests a weathered leather journal that carries one of America's darkest family stories. The journal, uncovered in 1943 by forest rangers clearing an old trail once used by trappers, holds 147 pages of careful daily entries written in 3 different styles, all belonging to members of the same household. What those pages reveal about the winter of 1867 in the far-off Bitterroot Mountains challenges everything once believed about survival, sanity, and the shadows of human nature. The officials who first opened those entries quickly marked them as classified. For many decades, the truth about the Wainwright family stayed hidden in government files, labeled too disturbing for ordinary people to see. Before we move forward into the story of Barnabas Wainwright and his 3 daughters, make sure to subscribe to our channel and tap the notification bell. Stories like this one are why we search so carefully through America's forgotten records. And share in the comments where you are listening from, because the story you're about to hear could happen in any lonely part of the country during those hard frontier winters. The discovery of that journal permanently changed how investigators looked at missing person cases from the 1860s. What took place in that isolated cabin was not only a sad tragedy. It was a step-by-step record of how loneliness, grief, and desperation could reshape even the most faithful father into someone almost unrecognizable. Barnabas Wainwright had earned his reputation as one of the most skilled fur traders working between Fort Benton and the Canadian border. At 42 years old, he was respected across the Montana Territory as a man who managed to endure where many others failed. He understood the ways of the wilderness and the balance needed to live in a land that destroyed those who came unprepared. His trading post, set along Beaver Creek in the Bitterroot Mountains, was a vital stop for trappers, gold seekers, and the occasional army patrol passing through the rough country. The Wainwrights were seen as everything frontier families hoped to be. Barnabas had married Catherine Bellwether, the well-educated daughter of a Methodist preacher from St. Louis in 1851. She followed him west with the determination typical of frontier wives, teaching herself how to cure meat, treat wounds, and keep a proper home even when the nearest neighbor was 30 miles away. Their 3 daughters, Margaret 26, Elizabeth 24, and Sarah 21, took after their mother's cleverness and their father's toughness. Unlike many children raised on the frontier, they received a full education, with Catherine insisting on lessons every day, even in the coldest months. Margaret, the eldest, had an almost perfect memory and kept the family records, writing down trade deals, weather details, and supply counts. Elizabeth became known for her sewing and healing skills, often tending to injure trappers who came with frostbite, infections, or broken bones. Sarah, the youngest, had a rare sense for calming stoned animal behavior, skills that had saved the family more than once from dangerous situations. The Wainwright post sat in a natural clearing thick with pine trees. Beaver Creek gave them water all year and easy access to the main trapping paths. Barnabas had built their main cabin from strong logs with a stone base, made to survive the brutal Montana winters that could cut families off for months. Beside it stood a smokehouse, a storage shed, and a smaller guest cabin for passing traders. By 1867, the family was wealthy by frontier standards. Barnabas controlled large trapping rights, traded regularly with local native tribes, and held several mining claims that showed signs of valuable ore. The Wainwright name was respected from Fort Benton to Helena. Army leaders and territorial officials often sought Barnabas's advice about the northern wilderness. Catherine wrote out often to her family back in St. Louis, and her letters from the summer of 1867 painted a picture of peace and success. She described Margaret's engagement to a merchant from Helena, Elizabeth's growing reputation as a healer among native people, and Sarah's talent for drawing wildlife, which impressed visitors who paid her for her artwork. Life on the frontier meant long stretches of isolation. The Wainwrights relied on one another for company, conversation, and support. During the endless winters, they gathered each evening near their big stone fireplace, Catherine reading books ordered from Eastern publishers, the daughters working on household projects, and Barnabas telling stories from his travels or planning future trading trips. Their strong, balanced life carried on for over 15 years, with the family meeting every challenge through care, cooperation, and practical skills that meant the difference between life and death in Montana's unforgiving land. Sparse neighbors saw the Wainwrights as a model family, proof that order and refinement could live even in the farthest reaches of the West. But on October 15, 1867, everything changed. That date marked the beginning of what old settlers would later call the most brutal winter in Montana's history. The first blizzard arrived without the usual signs that mountain people depended on. It blew down from the Canadian peaks with sudden, violent force, shocking even hardened frontiersmen. Catherine Wainwright had just returned from the creek, where she'd gone to wash bedding before the freeze, when the storm's fierce winds pushed her from the narrow log bridge crossing the rushing water. Margaret's journal entry from that day, written in her precise hand, recalls hearing her mother's cries over the roar of the wind. The three daughters rushed into the blizzard, following Catherine's voice, until they found her beneath the fallen bridge. Heavy timbers had trapped her legs in the icy water, where chunks of ice were already forming along the banks. It took all four of them to pull her free, but by then she had been stuck in the freezing current for nearly an hour. Barnabas carried his unconscious wife back to the cabin, where they stripped away her wet clothes and tried every remedy they knew to bring back her warmth. For 3 days, Catherine drifted between fever and faint awareness. Her body shook with chills, clear signs of pneumonia. Elizabeth's entries from those nights showed the family's growing panic as their mother's health slipped away despite their care. Their medical supplies were limited, and the nearest doctor was more than 80 miles away in a town that would soon be cut off by snow. Catherine's breathing grew weaker, and she began speaking wildly of her childhood in Missouri, no longer recognizing her husband or daughters in her brief clear moments. On October 18, 1867, Catherine Wainwright passed away in her sleep. The loss left her family stunned, unready for the crushing grief of losing the woman who had been their heart and guide. Barnabas, who had never spent a night apart from her in 16 years of marriage, sat by her body for nearly half a day, refusing to let his daughters begin the grim work of burial preparations. But practical problems came quickly. The ground had already frozen too hard to dig, making burial impossible until spring. Following frontier custom, they would need to preserve Catherine's body in the smokehouse. This grim reality forced the family to face her physical presence every day through the long winter. Margaret's journal describes the haunting moment of moving their mother, wrapped in their best quilts, to the cold storage building, where she would remain for the next 6 months. More troubling than the practical problems, however, were the strange changes in Barnabas's mind that started showing almost right after Catherine's death. Sarah's journal notes that her father no longer slept in the room he had shared with her mother, but instead stayed awake in the main room each night, staring at the chair where Catherine used to sit during their evening time together. He stopped caring for his appearance, letting his beard grow out in a wild tangle and wearing the same wrinkled, dirty clothes day after day. The first clear sign of his mind slipping further came on October 25th. We and Barnabas started having long conversations with Catherine's empty chair, talking about trading, family concerns, and daily work as though she were still alive and answering him. At first, the daughters thought this was just grief, believing he would slowly come to terms with the truth of her death and return to normal. But by early November, Barnabas was setting her place at the dinner table, serving her food, which of course sat untouched throughout the meal. When Margaret gently suggested that they stop this painful routine, Barnabas exploded in anger, accusing his eldest daughter of insulting her mother and even threatening to ban her from future meals if she ever spoke like that again. The family's isolation made everything worse. Harsh winter storms cut them off completely from help or even casual contact with others. The nearest neighbors, the Hendersons, lived 28 miles to the south, down a road that was impossible to travel once the heavy snows began in late November. Soldiers who sometimes rode through the area during warmer months had also stopped their patrols for winter, leaving the Wainwrights completely alone until spring. Elizabeth wrote in her journal that she felt their father was slipping into a place where mother still lives and where we are becoming strangers to him. She described finding Barnabas in the middle of loud arguments with Catherine's chair. As though answering words no one else could hear, his voice would rise and fall, full of emotion, exactly like a man caught in a real debate. As November's bitter winds trapped the Wainwrights in their mountain home, the heavy reality of their situation settled over the cabin like a thick, suffocating blanket. By Thanksgiving, snow piled up as high as the bottom of the windows, making their cabin feel like a white prison, shutting out every sound except the whistling of the wind and the haunting cries of wolves, who seemed to grow braver with every night. Margaret's writings show how fast their carefully ordered life fell apart. Without Catherine to keep things steady, normal routines crumbled. Meals became irregular, with Barnabas sometimes forgetting to eat at all for days, then suddenly demanding great feasts in honor of Catherine, as if she might sit down and join them. The daughters lived in fear of upsetting him, never knowing what simple word or action might spark another furious outburst. Barnabas's treatment of Catherine's belongings grew even more troubling. He moved all of her clothes, jewelry, and keepsakes from their bedroom into the main living room, arranging them carefully around her chair, as though preparing for her to come back and claim them. He spent hours each day brushing Catherine's hair, which he had cut from her head, before putting her body in the smokehouse, speaking softly to it as if she could hear him. Sarah's journal holds the most chilling details about his decline. She describes seeing him late at night, naked before the fire, whispering about his early days with Catherine, about their courtship, their wedding night, and other private things that no child should ever have to hear. When Sarah tried to cover him with a blanket, he shoved her away violently, shouting that she was interrupting a serious conversation with her mother. By December, Barnabas no longer treated his daughters like his children. Instead, he began seeing them as unwanted intruders in the home he imagined sharing with Catherine. He accused them of stealing her attention, insisting that Catherine spent too much time worrying over them and not enough on him. When he spoke like this, his eyes went distant and wild, and his voice swung between soft, begging tones and deep, threatening growls. The daughters were trapped by the deep snow outside and by their father's crumbling sanity inside. Elizabeth wrote about the fear of never knowing what version of their father they would face. Sometimes he was the weeping widower who mourned his wife, but other times he was a dangerous stranger, blaming them for Catherine's death and resenting that they still lived while she did not. Food, which had seemed enough when planned for their normal eating habits, began running low as Barnabas's grief swung between refusing meals and demanding excessive ones. The daughters also found out he had been secretly throwing away portions of their meat, saying Catherine warned him it was rotten. When they argued with him, he accused them of trying to poison him and his wife, and he began hiding food around the cabin in places only he knew. The wolves outside grew bolder. Drawn by the smell of food and the presence of humans, they gathered in larger numbers each night. Sarah, with her skill in drawing, kept careful notes of their behavior, writing that the pack had grown to more than 30 wolves, far larger than any group she had ever seen. They circled closer to the cabin, their eerie house filling the night like some cruel echo of the family's despair. Margaret's entry on December 15th marked a turning point. She wrote, "Father spoke to Mother's chair for 3 hours today. When he finally stopped, he looked at us with an expression I have never seen before. It was not the look of a father toward his daughters. It was the look of a man seeing something else entirely. I fear we are losing not just Father's mind, but his recognition of who we are." She went on. He asked Elizabeth to brush her hair like Mother used to, and when she did, His stare was unsettling. Then he demanded Sarah wear Catherine's blue dress from their anniversary. When Sarah refused, Barnabas smashed dishes against the wall and shouted that they were dishonoring their mother. Margaret noted that in his voice was something worse than anger, an indication that he no longer saw Sarah as his child, but as someone else altogether. Elizabeth, though only partly trained in medicine, recognized that her father's condition resembled what doctors of the time called a brain fever, or nervous exhaustion, often caused by deep emotional pain mixed with isolation and hardship. Yet this knowledge offered little comfort. It did not help her manage a grown man whose behavior had become unpredictable and dangerous. The sisters began sleeping in shifts so that one would always be awake to watch him. They discovered he was sneaking out at night, poorly dressed for the cold, to visit Catherine's body in the smokehouse. These late night visits often lasted hours, and when he returned, his behavior toward them was even more disturbing. Sarah's journal entry from December 20th is perhaps the most frightening. She wrote, "Last night, I followed Father to the smokehouse and listened outside. He was speaking to Mother as though she were still alive, telling her how empty he felt, how lonely their bed was, how much he missed her touch. But then his tone shifted, and he began speaking of Elizabeth, Margaret, and me in ways that made my skin crawl. He said we looked like her, that we moved like her, that in the dim light, he could almost believe we were her." Christmas Day of 1867 marked the beginning of what the journals would later describe as the darkest part of the Wainwright family's suffering. Margaret's note from that morning begins with an observation that would soon prove hauntingly true. "Father woke us before daylight, ordering us to put on Mother's clothing for Christmas breakfast. At the table he had placed 5 settings instead of 4. When I asked why, he stared at me with genuine puzzlement and said, 'For your mother, of course. She'll be here soon.' The endless strain of living under constant watch was starting to wear down the daughters' ability to hold themselves together. Elizabeth's entries show that she had begun to suffer from sharp headaches and sudden spells of dizziness. She believed these came from the stress of trying to manage her father's increasingly unpredictable actions while at the same time pretending to keep up some kind of normal family life. Sarah's drawings also began to take a darker shape. Her sketches now showed wolves with disturbingly human eyes and shadowy forms waiting just beyond the edge of sight. The most shocking discovery came on December 28th, when Margaret learned that their father had been secretly writing letters to Catherine. In these pages he spoke of his deep attraction to the young women who remind me so much of you. Hidden beneath his mattress, these letters contained graphic descriptions of physical wants and romantic thoughts no father should ever have toward his daughters. Ordem Fria. Margaret's notes describe her horror at reading them, especially at Barnabas's repeated claims that God had sent his daughters to ease his sorrow, and that Catherine's spirit had told him it was right to find comfort in their arms. Elizabeth, who had some medical knowledge, began studying the few books they had about nervous disorders and mental illness. She came across cases where long grief and isolation caused people to lose touch with reality completely, leaving them unable to tell the difference between right and wrong relationships. Yet even with this knowledge, her understanding did little to help when faced with the grim fact that they were stuck in a lonely cabin with a man whose sense of morality had completely broken apart. Sarah's entry from January 2nd, 1868, records the first clear confrontation between the daughters and their father's disturbing behavior. Father trapped Elizabeth in the pantry that morning and tried to kiss her on the mouth, saying she looked pretty in Mother's apron. When she shoved him away, he grew furious and accused her of being heartless and cold. He claimed Mother would never have refused his love, and that Elizabeth was failing in her duty as a woman to comfort the man of the house. The event terrified the sisters, who now realized their father's decline had gone beyond grief or confusion and entered into something far more threatening. Margaret's journal explains their frantic attempts to make plans for protecting themselves while trying not to anger their unstable father further. At the same time, the wolves' behavior outside had grown more troubling. Sarah's notes describe how the animals had begun coming near the cabin, even during the daytime. No longer afraid of humans and moving with hunting patterns that showed they were stalking the family directly. Their night howls had changed into more layered cries, sounding almost like a language, which gave the family the feeling of being under siege. Food stores had dropped to a critical level. Their father's wasteful eating and strange habits worsened the problem, creating a true survival crisis. Elizabeth's math suggested that they had only 6 weeks of food left under normal use, but Barnabas made careful rationing impossible. He started hiding food in secret places around the cabin, saying Catherine had warned him about thieves and refused to eat anything his daughters prepared. He insisted only Catherine could be trusted to touch his meals. On January 8th, Margaret wrote about how desperate they had become. "We have thought about trying to reach the Hendersons' place despite the snow and the wolves." Elizabeth believes she could make the journey, but Sarah's small size and my lack of outdoor skill make the attempt too risky. More worrying is the question of leaving father behind and whether he would even let us go. The sisters discovered he had been disabling their winter tools, moving snowshoes from storage, hiding coats and gear. When asked, he pretended not to know, but his actions showed he was making sure they stayed trapped inside with him. Elizabeth's entry says, "I think father knows on some level that his feelings toward us are wrong. But instead of fighting them, he is working to stop us from escaping them." The worst shock came when Sarah uncovered more letters. These ones were not for Catherine, but for each of his daughters. Hidden in the smokehouse where he kept his night watches, the letters contained detailed notes of his growing romantic obsession with them, complete with plans for marriage and life together, that showed how far he had fallen from reason. Sarah's journal describing this discovery gives a painful picture of their world. Father's letters prove he no longer thinks of us as daughters. In his mind, we are simply young women living in his house, possible wives who can take mother's place in every way. He writes about our looks, our habits, our roles as partners with the same cold tone he once used when talking about trade. Most terrifying of all, he seems to believe mother has approved these ideas through messages he claims to receive when he visits her body. By mid-January, the sisters understood that surviving the winter meant not just enduring hunger and storms, but managing their father, whose sickness now made him a direct threat to their safety and dignity. Their writings show how they slowly realized the man they once admired was gone. In his place stood a stranger whose intentions grew more dangerous every day. Then came the blizzard on January 18th, 1868, later remembered as the worst storm in Montana's history. But for the Wainwrights, it was more than just weather. It was the final lock, holding them inside with their father's broken mind. Margaret's note from that day carries only one chilling line. "The storm has blocked our escape, and father said at breakfast that God has blessed him by keeping his new wives here." Elizabeth's observations provide clear detail of Barnabas's final breakdown. He stopped sleeping at all, spending the night switching between heated talks with Catherine's empty chair and more violent efforts to pull his daughters into unwanted contact. His look had changed into something almost beast-like. Wild hair, empty eyes, a thin frame that made him appear less human and more like a starving predator. The discovery of Barnabas's wedding plans brought fresh horror. Sarah described finding rings he had crafted from melted silver coins and rough marriage papers written in his shaky hand. Each one said he would marry a daughter in a separate ceremony, witnessed by Catherine Wainwright, signed in his own writing. And just when it seemed things could not grow darker, the horror of the Bitterroot Mountains only deepened. Margaret's entry from January 22nd shows how trapped they felt. "Father grabbed me in the storeroom today and showed me the ring he made for our marriage. When I told him fathers cannot marry daughters, he exploded with rage and screamed that I was no longer his child. I was a woman staying in his home, eating his food, and therefore bound to give him the companionship that our mother's death had taken away. His eyes showed no memory of our bond, only a hunger that filled me with fear. The organized and methodical nature of Barnabas's plotting became clear when Elizabeth uncovered detailed schedules that he had written for his courtship of each daughter. These notes, written in the same neat handwriting he once used for business accounts, listed exact days for romantic meals, private conversations, and physical displays of affection with each girl. The cold, business-like tone of these documents made them even more horrifying than if they had been written in passionate words. Sarah's gift for art became important in recording proof of their father's mental collapse. Uma ordem fria, her drawings show the cabin turned into a grotesque imitation of a wedding setting, with Catherine's belongings arranged as decorations for the ceremonies he had planned. The most disturbing drawing shows his bedroom, redecorated with stolen items from his daughter's possessions, forming a shrine that mixed memories of his dead wife with fantasies about his living children. The wolves' behavior had now reached new levels of boldness. They tested the cabin's defenses in daylight, no longer waiting for night. Elizabeth's notes describe how they worked in groups, with some distracting while others searched for weaknesses in the building. Their constant presence removed any chance of escape, even when weather briefly allowed travel. Food was running out, but Barnabas's hoarding and waste made things far worse. He had begun using food as a weapon of control. Margaret's journal tells how their father would deny meals to any daughter who refused his improper advances, claiming that wives who failed to give affection to their husbands did not deserve to eat. This cruel game of starvation was psychological warfare, showing his ability to plan and carry out cruel strategies despite his madness. The most terrifying moment happened on January 28th, when Elizabeth woke to see her father standing naked at her bedside, clutching one of his homemade wedding rings. Sarah's journal tells of hearing her sister's screams and rushing to help, only to find their father in a state of arousal, trying to force the ring onto Elizabeth's finger while whispering prayers about fulfilling God's will. The three daughters had to restrain him physically, a nightmare that left them certain even worse assaults were coming. Elizabeth's journal from that night shows their despair. We cannot pretend anymore that father will recover or that time will fix this. He has become a predator in our home, and we are his prey. The man who once taught us to read, who kept us safe, who loved us as his daughters, no longer exists. In his place is something that sees us only as objects for his satisfaction. Their attempts to reason with him became not just pointless but dangerous, since any rejection provoked violent outbursts. Margaret discovered that Barnabas had been sharpening knives and hiding weapons around the cabin, preparing in case his daughters fought back. His past military training gave him tactical skills that made him dangerous even in madness. Sarah's journal gives the most chilling description of his condition. When father looks at us now, she wrote, there is no trace of care or love, only the calculating eyes of a man judging potential victims. He believes mother's death freed him from moral laws and that we are his rightful reward for his loss. Most horrifying, he truly does not understand why we resist him, as though our fear and disgust are just hurdles to push past with persistence and force. By early February, the sisters knew survival meant creating defenses, though his military mind and deep knowledge of their habits made this nearly impossible. They began sleeping in turns, blocking doors with furniture, and hiding makeshift weapons. But these measures offered only weak protection against a man with both the strength to overpower them and the cunning to use their emotions against them. February 14th, 1868, Valentine's Day, marked the peak of Barnabas Wainwright's madness and the start of a nightmare that would echo through Montana's history. Margaret's journal, that morning recorded, perhaps the most chilling line ever written by a frontier woman father, announced that today would be his wedding to Sarah, and Elizabeth and I would serve as witnesses to God's blessing. The last confrontation began when Sarah refused to wear Catherine's wedding dress, which Barnabas had preserved and alter to fit her smaller body. His reaction showed the complete death of his fatherly instincts. He struck Sarah across the face, so hard she fell against the stone fireplace, cutting her forehead above the eye and leaving a scar for life. Elizabeth's medical training became vital. As Barnabas tried to force Sarah into the dress, Elizabeth struck him with a heavy iron skillet, stunning him for a moment and giving the sisters their first chance to fight back. Yet their father's old military discipline and physical strength made him a frightening opponent, even in madness. Margaret's journal describes the brutal fight. Father recovered and charged like a wounded beast, no longer speaking words, but making animal sounds from deep in his throat. We fought with whatever we could reach. Kitchen tools, fireplace irons. Yet he seemed to feel no pain and did not recognize us as his daughters. His eyes burned only with rage and a terrible hunger, making him look more wolf than man. The fight tore through the cabin for nearly an hour, shattering windows, overturning furniture, and leaving blood smeared everywhere. Sarah's drawings later showed the aftermath with haunting clarity, turning the room into a battlefield where a family had fought for their very souls. The most awful part was Catherine's belongings scattered across the wreckage, silent reminders of what their family had once been. Elizabeth's wrist was broken in the struggle, while Margaret was cut deeply across her shoulder by a knife wielded with frightening precision. Sarah, though the smallest and youngest, proved the quickest, using her knowledge of the cabin and her father's habits to stay ahead of his lunges. The turning point came when Margaret realized his obsession with Catherine could be used against him. While Sarah and Elizabeth fought defensively, Margaret screamed, wailed, that Catherine's spirit hated what he was doing, that their mother's ghost was furious over his treatment of them. For a moment, this broke through. He stopped, staring at Catherine's empty chair. Sarah wrote that something changed in his face, just a flicker of the man he once was, horrified and afraid of what he had become. But then his expression hardened, and he spoke words that haunted them forever. Catherine is dead, and you killed her by being born. You will replace her, or you will join her. The final phase of the battle came when Barnabas understood his daughters would never agree to his demands. He chose instead to use brute force to claim what he wanted. Elizabeth's journal tells of his systematic effort to overpower each of them, beginning with Sarah, his chosen bride.